Hey guys, tonight we begin with why food was a daily struggle in the Soviet Union. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. It is often said that the measure of a society can be found in how it feeds its people. For the ordinary citizens of the Soviet Union, food was not simply nourishment, nor was it a casual matter of taste and preference. It was a daily ordeal, a constant negotiation with shortages, queues, and compromises that stretched across entire decades. Imagine for a moment a life where something as simple as bread, milk, or a piece of meat was never taken for granted, where the act of obtaining a basic meal carried with it a layer of uncertainty, anxiety, and resignation. This was the quiet struggle that defined daily existence for millions of Soviet families. From the outside, the Soviet Union projected an image of progress and strength. Propaganda films showed tables laden with food, workers smiling over communal dinners, and children sipping warm milk in classrooms as if the state itself provided abundance. But behind this carefully painted image lay the truth. Families rose in the early hours of the morning to stand in line, sometimes for hours, not even knowing what would arrive on the delivery truck. Mothers would drag their children along, handing them books or toys to pass the time, hoping that by the time they reached the front of the line, there would still be something left. Fathers already tired from long shifts at the factory sometimes joined these queues in the evening, their worn hands stuffed into their coat pockets, their breath turning to vapor in the icy winter air as they wondered whether they might return home with only a loaf of stale bread or perhaps nothing at all. The struggle was not only about food itself, but about the human dignity wrapped up in it. In a land where official slogans spoke of equality and the bright future of communism, people often found themselves bartering, hoarding, and cultivating private gardens just to ensure their families would not go hungry. To survive meant developing quiet strategies, whispered secrets, and unspoken agreements. It meant knowing someone at the store who might slip you a little extra butter, or having a cousin in the countryside who could spare potatoes or eggs when city shops stood bare. These arrangements were not written in law or in newspapers, but they were written in the weary expressions of Soviet citizens who understood that without them, life could teeter dangerously close to desperation. Consider the image of a Soviet kitchen in the 1970s. The space is cramped, the wallpaper peeling slightly near the stove, the furniture heavy and plain. A single refrigerator, if the family was lucky enough to own one, hummed in the corner, its interior often half empty. A jar of pickled vegetables sits on the shelf. A pot of thin soup simmers on the stove. And on the table lies a dark loaf of black bread, its edges hardened, its texture dense. A mother ladles out the soup carefully, making sure each child gets a portion, while the father breaks the bread into even slices. There is no abundance here, no second helpings without thought. Every bite must be stretched, every scrap accounted for. To live in this rhythm was to internalize the awareness that food was not guaranteed, that each day's sustenance carried with it a measure of luck, patience, and quiet endurance. The story of Soviet food shortages is inseparable from the structure of the planned economy itself. On paper, the system promised fairness and balance. Every farm, every factory, every store was part of a grand design meant to eliminate waste and inequality. In practice, however, this rigid system often failed to predict the simple realities of human appetite and agricultural unpredictability. A bad harvest in one region could ripple outward, leaving city shelves bare. A factory that miscalculated its quotas could mean shortages of canned goods or sugar for months. And because officials feared reporting failure, statistics were often manipulated, painting a picture of abundance that citizens knew bore little resemblance to reality. This dissonance between official promises and daily life created a peculiar psychological burden. Propaganda posters encouraged people to be grateful, to celebrate the triumphs of Soviet agriculture, to believe in the party's vision of prosperity. Yet, the reality they encountered was long lines and empty shelves. This contradiction taught people to live in two worlds at once, the one presented in speeches and newspapers, and the one they experienced in their own kitchens. To cope, many retreated inward, building small circles of trust where truth could be spoken quietly among friends and family, even if never allowed in public. Food, in this sense, became not just about nourishment, but about truth, itself a daily reminder of the gap between ideology and reality. To walk into a Soviet grocery store was an experience that would feel alien to someone raised in abundance. Instead of endless aisles overflowing with goods, there were often bare counters and long waits. If meat appeared, it was often tough and fatty. Milk, when available, might spoil quickly, forcing families to boil it before use. Fresh fruit was rare and seasonal, with bananas or oranges appearing only as special treats around holidays, and even then rationed out in small quantities. To see such fruit was to feel the rush of excitement, as if encountering a treasure, something exotic and fleeting. It was not uncommon for people to visit multiple stores in a single day, walking long distances with the hope of finding something useful. A mother might stop by one shop for bread, another for milk, and still another in hopes of butter, carrying heavy bags across town. Often, however, she returned with little to show for her effort. This endless search was a shared experience, a kind of silent solidarity among Soviet citizens. Strangers exchanged rumors in lines, whispering about which store had flour, which butcher had meat, which vendor might be receiving a delivery of eggs. Information was currency, and to know where food could be found was as valuable as the food itself. Children, too, felt the weight of scarcity. They were taught not to waste, not to complain, not to expect too much. A piece of candy was savored, unwrapped slowly, divided sometimes among siblings. School lunches were simple and repetitive, often consisting of thin porridge or bread with a smear of margarine. Yet, for many children, even these small meals were remembered fondly because they represented a brief escape from the worry that hovered constantly over their parents' shoulders. In hindsight, many adults who grew up during this time recall the sense of community and resilience that developed among children, even as they recognized the hardships their parents bore silently. The paradox of Soviet food life is that, despite shortages, people often carried with them deep memories of flavor and tradition. Grandmothers preserved recipes handed down through generations, improvising with whatever ingredients they could find. Cabbage, potatoes, and root vegetables formed the backbone of countless meals, their versatility a testament to human creativity under constraint. Families pickled vegetables in jars, smoked fish when available, and learned to stretch meat into soups and stews that could feed a family for days. These practices were born of necessity, but they also carried with them a sense of cultural continuity, a quiet pride that even in hardship, traditions could endure. The first batch of our story is not about the dramatic headlines or political speeches, but about the quiet, grinding reality of everyday life. The Soviet people's relationship with food was not only physical but emotional, tied to identity, dignity, and survival. Each loaf of bread, each jar of preserves, each weary queue outside a shop told a story of resilience and adaptation. Theirs was not an existence of abundance, but of endurance. And in this endurance lay the true story of the Soviet Union's everyday life. If you picture the Soviet dining table, you must understand that it was never merely a place where food was shared. It was a place where worries were whispered, strategies were devised, and families gathered not just to eat, but to make sense of how they would eat tomorrow. Every meal was tied to an unseen network of effort. A queue stood in, a favor called in, a lucky encounter with a delivery, or the generosity of a friend who had a little extra. To outsiders, food shortages were statistics, but to the people who lived them, they were felt most deeply in the hollow of the stomach and the heavy silence that fell when shelves stood bare. The family's burden was never evenly distributed. Women, in particular, shouldered much of the responsibility for navigating the food system. A mother's day could easily be consumed by the task of finding, buying, and preparing what little could be obtained. She rose before dawn, sometimes wrapping herself in heavy coats to stand in line outside a bakery where frost clung to windows and fellow citizens stamped their feet to keep warm. Hours might pass before the shutters lifted and the bread was handed out, each loaf carefully counted. Some women would rush from one line to another, hoping to secure additional staples before the supply vanished. It was not unusual for entire days to be spent like this, chasing rumors of deliveries, navigating shortages, and negotiating with store clerks. There was an emotional toll too. Imagine the weight of knowing that your children might not eat enough, or that your husband would return from a long shift at the factory to find only a thin soup awaiting him. Mothers carried this quiet shame, not because they had failed, but because the system had failed them. Yet in that shame was also ingenuity. Women learned how to make soups richer with bones, how to stretch porridge with water, how to pickle vegetables in summer to last through winter. These were acts of resilience disguised as meals. Children saw the hardship even when parents tried to shield them. They noticed the worry in their mother's eyes, the way she divided bread into careful slices, the way their father chewed slowly to hide his hunger so that the children could eat first. Even the youngest understood that food was precious. This awareness shaped entire generations, teaching them to avoid waste, to eat what was given, to treasure even the smallest indulgence. A single piece of candy, saved for weeks, might be cut into pieces to share among siblings. A sausage obtained after hours in line might be remembered for months, retold as a story of luck and victory. Yet for all the hardship, there were also moments of community. Lines themselves became strange, temporary societies. People who had never met before found themselves standing together for hours, sharing gossip, exchanging news, or quietly helping one another. An elderly man might save a spot in line for a mother who had gone to fetch her child. A stranger might whisper that a nearby store had just received a shipment of eggs, sending the crowd rushing in that direction. These lines were wearying, frustrating, even humiliating, but they were also places where solidarity bloomed in small ways. Still, not everyone was equal in this system. Those who worked in certain positions, such as in factories or government offices, often had access to special distribution centers where food was slightly more reliable. Party officials and those connected to the state apparatus were the most privileged, enjoying better quality food and more consistent supplies. This inequality was visible to ordinary people, even if spoken about only in private. It bred quiet resentment, a recognition that the promise of equality under communism was not felt at the dinner table. For those without privilege, survival often required creativity and persistence. Private gardens became lifelines. In the countryside, families grew potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and beets, storing them in cellars for the winter. City dwellers sometimes traveled to visit relatives in rural areas, returning with sacks of vegetables or jars of preserved goods. These homegrown contributions often meant the difference between endurance and despair. The tradition of preserving food, pickling cucumbers, fermenting cabbage, bottling jams was not just cultural but practical, a way to ensure sustenance in months when store shelves might be empty. Kitchens became small factories of survival, the smell of vinegar and boiling jars filling the air as families worked together to prepare for leaner times. Then there was the black market, known in whispers but vital in reality. Officially, the state condemned it, portraying it as an enemy of fairness and socialism. In truth, it thrived precisely because the state could not meet the needs of its people. From under-the-counter sales at stores to informal exchanges in back alleys, food found its way into circulation outside official channels. A butcher might slip extra meat to a trusted customer in exchange for vodka. A driver might transport sacks of flour from one region to another, selling them quietly to those willing to pay. These exchanges were illegal, risky, and sometimes exploitative, but they filled the gaps left by the state's inefficiencies. Ordinary people often had no choice but to participate, their desperation outweighing fear of punishment. Meals, when finally brought together, were often modest but deeply meaningful. Families sat down 2 bowls of soup, 2 bread cut into slices, 2 porridge sweetened with a little sugar if it could be found. The scarcity infused each bite with weight, a reminder of the effort it took to secure it. Holidays were particularly poignant, as families saved and planned for weeks to assemble special meals. A roast chicken at New Year's, a cake made with scarce flour and sugar, oranges for the children. These moments were not only about the food itself, but about the feeling of abundance. However brief, they were treasured precisely because they were rare, etched into memory as exceptions in a life of scarcity. As the years passed, people adapted to the rhythm of shortages, but it did not become easier. The frustration of waiting in line, the disappointment of empty shelves, the exhaustion of constant searching, all these became part of the background of daily life. Yet, within this struggle, there was also resilience. Soviet citizens developed a kind of quiet endurance, a capacity to survive and even to find meaning within deprivation. They joked about the shortages, told stories about their adventures in queues, and carried on because, quite simply, there was no alternative. The story of Soviet food, then, is not one of simple hunger. It is one of complexity, of contradiction, of human beings navigating a system that both provided and denied, that promised abundance yet delivered scarcity. The struggle for food was not just about eating it, it was about dignity, about fairness, about the emotional weight of survival in a society that demanded sacrifice while offering little in return. when we shift our eyes from the cities to the countryside, the struggle for food in the Soviet Union takes on a different but equally harrowing character. It is tempting to imagine that rural life was better, that peasants who tilled the soil and raised livestock lived with more abundance than their urban counterparts. The reality, however, was far more complicated. Collective farming, state quotas, and the demands of the planned economy meant that even those who worked with food were often deprived of it. The Soviet Union's countryside was dominated by the collective farm, or kolkhoz. On paper, these farms represented the triumph of socialism over private ownership. Land, tools, and labor were pooled together, and the output was meant to be shared fairly, with quotas delivered to the state to feed the cities and the Red Army. In practice, however, the quotas were crushingly high, leaving very little for the farmers themselves. Crops were harvested and loaded onto trucks bound for warehouses and distribution centers, while villagers watched sacks of grain depart without certainty that any of it would ever return to there. Tables. The irony was bitter. Those who grew the food often went hungry. Families in rural areas survived on what small patches of private land they were allowed to cultivate beside their homes. These tiny gardens, sometimes no larger than a modern backyard, became lifelines. Here, potatoes were planted in neat rows, chickens were raised for eggs, goats were milked, and vegetables were nurtured with care. It was this private produce, not the collective farm's yield, that often determined whether a family could endure the winter. The hardship of rural food supply was not simply physical, but psychological. Imagine being a farmer who labored from dawn until dusk in fields of wheat, yet returned home to a supper of potatoes and black bread, while the grain you harvested was whisked away to meet state quotas. The sense of injustice was palpable, but voicing it could be dangerous. Complaints could be interpreted as disloyalty, as resistance to the socialist project, and might lead to scrutiny or punishment. Silence, therefore, was the common language of discontent. Winter was the great test of endurance. Summers in the countryside were labor-intensive, filled with planting, tending, and harvesting. But the real measure came when the snow set in and the cellars were opened. Families counted their jars of pickles, sacks of potatoes, and bundles of dried herbs, calculating carefully how to ration them until spring. A failed harvest meant months of hunger. The cold only compounded the difficulty. Even preparing food was a battle when fuel was scarce, when frost crept into houses, and when the work of survival consumed every waking moment. Urban families often turned to their rural relatives for support. Trips from the city to the countryside became essential pilgrimages, with urban dwellers arriving by train or bus, bearing small gifts in exchange for sacks of vegetables or jars of preserved fruit. These exchanges were not merely about food, but about maintaining lifelines of kinship. For many, survival in the city depended directly on the labor of those in the countryside, and these bonds kept families afloat in a system that offered little security. But the countryside itself was not a paradise of abundance. Collective farms were plagued by inefficiencies, broken machinery, lack of fertilizer, poor planning dictated from distant bureaucrats who knew little of local soil or weather. Workers often had little incentive to work diligently in fields that did not belong to them, and so productivity suffered. The private plots thrived precisely because they were personal. People cared for them with a devotion born of necessity. The contrast was striking. A massive collective field might yield disappointing returns, while a village's garden produced vibrant cabbages, carrots, and potatoes. Food shortages were not occasional events, but structural realities. Even in years when the harvest was good, distribution faltered. Trains carrying food might be delayed, supplies might spoil before reaching markets, and storage facilities often lacked the means to preserve food properly. In the countryside, shortages sometimes forced people to barter directly with neighbors. A family with extra potatoes might trade them for eggs or butter, bypassing official channels altogether. This informal economy coexisted with the official one, and while it helped people survive, it also underscored the failure of the system to meet their needs. Children in the countryside grew up with food, insecurity as a constant companion. They learned from an early age to dig potatoes, to tend goats, to help with pickling and preserving. For them, hunger was not an abstract fear, but a lived reality, shaping their understanding of the world. It instilled resilience, yes, but also a kind of quiet fatalism. The recognition that survival required endless work and that satisfaction was always fleeting. Yet within these struggles, moments of humanity persisted. A neighbor might bring over a loaf of bread to share. Families gathered for simple meals, and in those meals there was often laughter, storytelling, and warmth. Holidays were celebrated with what little could be gathered, perhaps a roast chicken, a cake sweetened with honey, or a rare bottle of vodka passed around the table. These moments did not erase the hardship, but they gave it context, anchoring life in rituals of endurance and resilience. The rural-urban divide remained sharp. While cities dealt with long queues and rationing, villagers faced the bitterness of seeing their labor exported away. And yet, despite these differences, both shared the same overarching truth. Food was not guaranteed. It had to be fought for, bargained for, and treasured when obtained. This deep entanglement of food and survival shaped Soviet identity itself. To speak of food in the Soviet Union was never just to speak of nourishment. It was to speak of dignity, struggle, adaptation, and the unending effort to endure within a system that demanded sacrifice at every turn. The story of rural life, with its gardens, its collective farms, its winters of rationing, is inseparable from the larger narrative of Soviet food scarcity. If food was scarce in the Soviet Union, its meaning became larger than life. To understand the daily struggle, one cannot stop at the physical act of eating or the lack thereof. Food was deeply entwined with identity, memory, culture, and emotion. It was a mirror that reflected the entire Soviet experience, the triumphs, the humiliations, the compromises, and the survival instincts that defined the era. For many families, food scarcity shaped their most intimate memories. Children often remembered the first time they stood with their mother in an endless bread line, stamping their feet against the cold, watching as adults shifted uneasily, praying the bread would not run out before their turn. These moments became etched into the minds of generations, forming part of their shared inheritance. To grow up Soviet was, in some ways, to grow up with hunger. Even if the table was not always empty, the fear that it could be never quite disappeared. In households, food preparation itself was an act of resilience. Kitchens were small, cramped, and often under-equipped, yet they became sites of ingenuity. Housewives learned to stretch ingredients, to transform scraps into meals, to boil bones into broth that could last for days. Recipes were passed down not simply as instructions for cooking, but as strategies for survival. A grandmother might show her granddaughter how to make kasha from buckwheat or oats, not only to feed her stomach, but to pass along the lesson that resourcefulness was as important as ingredients. Special occasions were especially telling. Birthdays, weddings, or New Year celebrations were not marked by grand feasts, but by careful accumulation of treats saved over weeks or even months. Families might sacrifice their own comfort to buy a few sweets for children or a piece of meat for a festive meal. These foods, rare and precious, were savored not just for their taste, but for what they represented: joy in the midst of struggle, celebration in the shadow of scarcity. It was common for food to carry emotional weight across generations. A mother who had endured the hunger of wartime rationing might raise her children with an almost obsessive concern about food, urging them to eat every crumb of bread, never to waste even the smallest piece. These lessons were absorbed deeply, creating a culture in which food waste was seen as nearly a sin, and where the memory of hunger lingered long after a meal had been eaten. In urban apartments, the refrigerator was not just an appliance, it was a symbol of aspiration. To have a well-stocked fridge, even for a short time, was to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. People would open it, look at its contents, and feel reassured, even if they knew those contents would vanish quickly. The act of storing food, pickles in jars, cabbages in sacks, jars of preserves lined neatly on a shelf, was an act of psychological defense. It said, "We are prepared, we will endure." The cultural symbolism of bread deserves special mention. Bread was more than food. It was sacred. In Russian tradition, bread had long been associated with hospitality, survival, and even spirituality. In the Soviet era, this symbolism only deepened. To waste bread was unthinkable. Crusts were dried and saved for soup, crumbs were swept up and eaten. Bread lines were often the longest, and bread ration cards the most prized. The smell of fresh loaves wafting from a bakery could both comfort and torment those waiting outside. Bread was the measure of whether a family was getting by or falling into despair. Another telling example is sugar. Sugar was one of the most coveted items in Soviet households. It was not just a sweetener, but a symbol of warmth and kindness. A spoonful in tea could lift spirits after a long day. To give someone sugar, especially to children, was a gesture of love and generosity. In times of shortage, parents might go without sugar in their own tea so that their child could have it. Small as it was, this sacrifice carried enormous meaning beyond individual households. Food shortages also shaped community relationships. Neighbors leaned on each other in quiet, subtle ways. If one family had access to eggs, they might share them with another in exchange for flour. These exchanges were rarely formal, but were understood as part of the fabric of survival. Helping others was not simply kindness, but a recognition that one day the roles could be reversed. A sense of collective endurance grew in these networks of quiet generosity. Still, the system itself often pitted people against each other. Queuing, for example, was not only exhausting, but also humiliating. The uncertainty, would there be enough meat, enough milk, enough flour, fostered tension. People jostled, argued, sometimes fought. Stories abound of lines turning hostile, of accusations, of cutting, of tempers flaring when the supplies ran out. These daily humiliations left scars, reminding people constantly that the system did not guarantee fairness, only endurance. Yet, despite the tension, humor was never far away. Soviet citizens developed a rich culture of jokes and satire about food shortages. Cartoons depicted people standing in endless lines for non-existent goods. Jokes circulated about the absurdity of the planned economy, like the famous one where someone asks, "Is this the line for meat?" and another replies, "No." This is the line for bread. The line for meat is around the corner, and the line to ask about it is 2 blocks away. Humor softened the edge of despair, creating a shared language of survival. Food also entered Soviet art and literature as both theme and metaphor. Writers described the hunger of peasants, the bleakness of empty stores, the longing for a piece of fruit in winter. Poets used bread as a symbol of dignity. Painters depicted the humble kitchen table as a place of both scarcity and love. In this way, food shortages became more than a material condition, they became part of the Soviet soul. Children's experiences deserve another moment of reflection. For them, food was often tied to longing. A child might dream of chocolate, bananas, or oranges, foods that were either unavailable or so rare that they were remembered for years. A child who received an orange at New Year's might recall the smell and taste decades later, associating it with wonder and delight. This scarcity made ordinary foods extraordinary, imprinting memories more vivid than abundance ever could. The culture of food in the Soviet Union then was not merely about what people ate or did not eat. It was about how they made sense of their world, how they endured humiliation, how they celebrated small joys, and how they carried memories of hunger into the future. It was a culture built on scarcity, but within that scarcity lay remarkable resilience, creativity, and solidarity. The first segment of our story, then, does not end simply with the observation that food was hard to come by. It ends with the recognition that food was never just about survival. It was about identity, dignity, memory, and endurance. It shaped how people saw themselves and their neighbors, how they raised their children, and how they remembered their past. And as we move forward, we will begin to see how this daily struggle, repeated across kitchens, queues, and fields, did not exist in isolation, but was woven into the very structure of Soviet life, influencing politics, culture, and the intimate bonds of family for decades. The Soviet Union was not only a land of villages and farms. By the mid-20th century, much of the population lived in sprawling cities filled with factories, grey apartment blocks, and endless lines of workers streaming to their shifts. Urban life brought its own rhythms, its own challenges, and when it came to food, its own set of struggles. If rural families wrestled with shortages through gardens, barter, and preservation, city dwellers faced a more relentless, unavoidable confrontation with scarcity every day. From the moment they stepped out their front door, the city was a place of queues. More than anything else, this was the defining feature of the urban food experience. One did not simply buy groceries. To feed a family, people dedicated hours, sometimes entire days, to waiting in line. Men and women would leave work early or bring children with them, standing in long snaking queues that stretched outside state-owned food shops. These shops were often dimly lit, shelves half empty, and the counters filled with goods of wildly inconsistent quality. Yet the act of waiting was a constant ritual. It was not unusual to stand in line without even knowing what would be available. People would join any queue they saw, reasoning that anything might be worth waiting for. Factories themselves became microcosms of food struggle. Workers in the Soviet system were expected to be productive cogs in the machine of industry. But they were also human beings who needed to eat. Canteens were established to provide meals for factory laborers, and in theory, these meals were subsidized and accessible. In practice, however, factory canteens varied enormously. Some offered little more than watery soups, stale bread, and weak tea. while others managed to serve more filling stews or porridge. The meals were rarely appetizing, but they were a lifeline for workers who could not count on bringing food from home. The quality of food in these canteens often became a subject of jokes and bitter complaints. Workers laughed grimly about, "She's so thin that a fly could drown in it," or sausages of such questionable origin that no one wanted to ask what they contained. Yet, however much they grumbled, they still lined up at the canteen window every day, trays in hand, because they had little choice. Rations, too, played a central role in the urban food economy. While rationing was most famously associated with the desperate years of war, in various forms it lingered on in Soviet cities for decades. Ration cards became small lifelines, little slips of paper that determined whether a worker or a family could claim basic staples: sugar, flour, cooking oil, when supplies were short. The process was bureaucratic and often humiliating. One had to present papers, sometimes stamped multiple times, and if a mistake was made or a name was missing from a list, it could mean going home empty-handed. In this environment, ingenuity was essential. Urban families turned tiny apartment kitchens into laboratories of survival. Women especially bore the burden of stretching meager rations. They would grind stale bread into crumbs to make cutlets, shred cabbage to create endless variations of soups, and save even potato peels for broth. Meals were rarely about abundance. They were about making something from almost nothing. To succeed in feeding one's family was to demonstrate quiet heroism. It was in the cities, too, that the black market thrived most openly. Known as the Blatt system, it was less a formal market than a web of connections. In a society where official supply could not meet demand, who you knew often mattered more than what you could afford. A friend who worked in a bakery might quietly set aside an extra loaf. A cousin employed at a butcher shop might call ahead when a shipment of meat arrived. An acquaintance with access to imported goods could provide coffee or chocolate at inflated prices. These networks of favors and hidden exchanges were essential to survival, and everyone, from factory workers to party officials, participated in them in some way. The Blatt was not merely about selfish gain, it was about mutual obligation. If you received a favor, you were expected to return it someday. In this way, the black market became an unspoken social contract, a shadow economy that functioned alongside the official one. For many Soviet citizens, navigating this parallel system was just as important as showing up to work each day. Urban markets also provided a glimpse of abundance, though, at a cost. Collective farmers sometimes brought goods into the cities, selling produce, eggs, or meat at open markets. These markets were vibrant, noisy places, filled with bargaining and chatter, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of state shops. But the prices were often far beyond what an ordinary worker could afford. Markets revealed the truth everyone knew but rarely said aloud, that there was food in the Soviet Union, but access to it was unequal, and wealthier families, or those with better connections, always fared better. One of the most bitter ironies of city life was the way propaganda contrasted with reality. Posters depicted smiling workers carrying baskets overflowing with fresh vegetables, or happy families gathered around tables piled high with bread and meat. Newspapers reported rising production, greater efficiency, a bright future. Yet outside the print shop or the billboard, real families stood shivering in lines for a single loaf, or returned home to find their ration cards had yielded only a few onions and some flour. The gap between image and reality gnawed at the public, breeding quiet cynicism. People learned to read between the lines of official announcements, to interpret what was not said more carefully than what was. Children growing up in Soviet cities quickly absorbed the reality of scarcity. School lunches were often bland and insufficient, and they learned the habit of trading among themselves an extra slice of bread for a bit of jam, or a hard-boiled egg swapped for candy. Many children were sent to wait in lines on behalf of their parents, experiencing firsthand the weary hours of standing, shuffling forward, and hoping. For them, scarcity became normal, woven into the fabric of childhood. In the evenings, families gathered in their apartments, often in communal housing shared with others. The kitchen was the center of life, but it was also a contested space, shared among multiple households. Arguments erupted over the use of the single stove, the storage of food in communal cupboards, or the lingering smell of someone else's cooking. Yet despite these tensions, kitchens also became places of intimacy and warmth. Friends gathered to share tea and conversation. Families whispered about politics over plates of boiled potatoes, and children sat at the table doing homework while a parent prepared soup. These small, crowded kitchens were both battlegrounds and havens, symbols of hardship but also of resilience. The story of food in Soviet cities is not only about deprivation but also about the ways people found to adapt, to endure, and to keep living despite the shortages. They became masters of patience in queues, inventors of endless recipes from scant ingredients, navigators of black market favors, and keepers of dignity in the face of constant want. Their struggle was not heroic in the grand public sense, but it was heroic in the quiet. Every day sensed the kind of heroism that kept families alive and society functioning even when the system itself faltered. This was the paradox of Soviet urban life. The system promised equality and abundance, yet what it delivered was scarcity, inequality, and exhaustion. And yet, within that contradiction, ordinary people carried on. They found ways to create comfort out of emptiness, to carve out humor in the midst of frustration, and to protect their families with whatever scraps they could find. As we step further into this story, we will see how these struggles for food were not isolated to individual kitchens or shops, but were tied deeply to the functioning of the state itself. Food was political. It was a weapon, a symbol, and sometimes a bargaining chip. To understand how people lived in Soviet cities, we must see not only what they ate, but how their meals reflected the failures, ambitions, and contradictions of the entire Soviet system. Food in the Soviet Union was never just food. It was political, symbolic, and tied to the very legitimacy of the state itself. Leaders promised bread, milk, and meat as proof that socialism worked, as evidence that their system had surpassed capitalism. To stand in line for hours, therefore, was not merely an inconvenience. It was a daily reminder of the gap between ideology and reality. This tension simmered beneath the surface of Soviet society, shaping how people thought, how they behaved, and even how they spoke to one another. The state understood the power of food as both a necessity and a tool of control. From the earliest days after the revolution, food distribution was treated not simply as an economic matter, but as a matter of political survival. The government controlled grain quotas, rationing systems, and supply chains. In times of crisis, food could be withheld from rebellious regions and redirected to those deemed loyal. Citizens were acutely aware that their access to bread and oil depended on the goodwill of officials, and this dependency created both resentment and obedience. The propaganda machine constantly projected an image of plenty. Posters depicted peasants carrying sheaves of golden wheat, children drinking tall glasses of fresh milk, and cheerful housewives laying tables heavy with bread and fish. The message was simple. Socialism had conquered hunger, capitalism had not. These images were powerful because they appealed to a basic human desire: security of food. After decades of famine, war, and uncertainty, the promise of abundance resonated deeply. But for the average person standing in yet another line for a meager cut of meat, these images became almost mocking. Ordinary Soviet citizens developed a dual consciousness: the ability to publicly repeat the slogans of plenty while privately acknowledging the constant shortages. This duality permeated everyday conversation. At work, one might nod approvingly when a manager praised rising grain production. At home, over dinner, one would joke bitterly about watery cabbage soup and empty store shelves. Humor became a survival strategy. Jokes about food scarcity circulated widely about sausages made of paper, about meatless meat, about shops that sold nothing but dust. These jokes were dangerous, yet they spread anyway, whispered in kitchens and told quietly among trusted friends. Each laugh a tiny rebellion. Memories of famine also haunted the Soviet Union, particularly among the older generation. Many adults in the 1950s and 1960s had lived through the famine years of the 1930s, or the terrible starvation during World War II. They knew what it meant to truly go without, to watch neighbors die of hunger, to eat grass or boiled bark for survival. These memories gave a sharp edge to the shortages of later years. Even when food was technically available, the fear of hunger remained. Families stockpiled flour, sugar, or canned goods whenever they could. Not because they needed them immediately, but because they remembered what it meant to face an empty cupboard. This culture of hoarding became ingrained, passed down to children who grew up seeing their parents store sacks of grain under beds or jars of preserves stacked to the ceiling. The Soviet state, meanwhile, used food as a way of enforcing loyalty. Certain jobs came with better rations or easier access to special stores. Party officials, military officers, and those working in politically important industries often enjoyed privileges unavailable to the general population. These perks were not only material but psychological. They reminded people of the connection between obedience and survival. To step out of line politically was to risk losing access to food. This hierarchy bred resentment, but it also ensured compliance, as few were willing to gamble with hunger. Even within factories and institutions, food allocation became a measure of favor. Workers who met production targets might be rewarded not with money but with extra rations. Students who excelled could be given better meals at school. In this way, the state intertwined nourishment with discipline, turning the dinner table into an extension of political authority. The symbolic weight of bread in Soviet society cannot be overstated. Bread was not merely food, it was identity, culture, and politics bound together. To waste bread was considered almost sacrilegious. To lack bread was a sign of disaster. State rhetoric often revolved around ensuring bread for all, and even propaganda posters featured loaves as central symbols of progress. In truth, however, bread was often rationed, its quality inconsistent, and its availability uncertain. Still, the sight of a fresh loaf was powerful, and the smell of baking bread became, for many, a rare comfort amid scarcity. Milk, too, carried heavy symbolism. Soviet propaganda often emphasized strong, healthy children drinking milk, a vision of the future generation nurtured by socialism. But in practice, milk shortages were frequent. Mothers sometimes waited in line for hours to secure even a single bottle for their infants. Powdered substitutes circulated, but they were viewed with suspicion, a poor replacement for the real thing. For many parents, the daily quest for milk became an exhausting ritual, one that left deep memories for those who grew up in the system. Meat was perhaps the greatest marker of privilege. To have meat regularly on the table was a sign of status, of being above the endless grind of scarcity. Yet for the average Soviet family, meat was an occasional luxury. Even when available, it was often tough, fatty, or of dubious quality. Sausage, supposedly a more accessible product, became a constant object of satire. People joked about sausages containing everything but meat. And yet, when rumors spread that sausage had arrived at a shop, lines formed instantly, people rushing to secure even a small portion. The black market, in this context, became more than just a practical solution. It became a parallel system of trust, loyalty, and social standing. To have connections meant to have food. A doctor who received eggs from a grateful patient. A teacher who was slipped sugar cubes by a parent. An engineer whose friend in the countryside sent potatoes. These small exchanges built networks that sustained entire communities. The state denounced such practices as corruption, but everyone, from high-ranking officials to ordinary citizens, relied on them. The hypocrisy was obvious but unspoken. Perhaps the most telling sign of how political food became was the silence that surrounded it. People rarely complained openly, at least not where strangers could hear. To criticize shortages too directly was to risk being labeled disloyal, even counter-revolutionary. Food, therefore, became a topic of coded language. Citizens learned to hint rather than state, to share grievances only with those they trusted absolutely. Kitchens, with their closed doors and steaming pots, became sanctuaries where truth could be spoken quietly, carefully, often while a radio blared music to drown out any chance of eavesdropping in this way. The struggle for food in Soviet cities was not just about feeding the body, but about navigating a complex web of politics, memory, and fear. To stand in line was to endure, but also to participate in a system that used scarcity as control. To barter or seek out the black market was to defy the official order, but also to accept that survival required bending the rules. Every loaf of bread, every bottle of milk, every slice of sausage was more than nourishment. It was a token of power, of loyalty, of quiet resistance. The paradox grew sharper with time. As the decades passed, Soviet leaders continued to proclaim success, pointing to statistics and posters that promised abundance. Yet the lived experience remained one of shortage, improvisation, and fatigue. The promise of socialism was that hunger would be banished forever. The reality was that hunger remained, not always in its most extreme form, but in the constant gnawing of scarcity. The daily reminder that the system could not deliver what it promised. As we move forward in this story, we will see how these political dynamics of food not only shaped daily life, but also sowed seeds of disillusionment. For many, the constant struggle to put food on the table was not simply exhausting. It was proof that the dream of abundance was an illusion. And when illusions fade, even the strongest systems begin to crack. The kitchen table was the true heart of Soviet family life, but it rarely displayed abundance. More often than not, it became the site of careful division, where each plate was portioned with precision and meals were stretched to feed everyone present. Mothers, especially, carried the burden of turning scarcity into something resembling a meal. They were artists of improvisation, able to transform a cabbage into soup, a handful of buckwheat into a filling porridge, or a bone into a broth that could last for days. Recipes were rarely written down because so much depended on availability. Instead, cooking became an exercise in adaptation, a daily puzzle of substitution and invention. Children absorbed this atmosphere of frugality without ever fully recognizing it. For them, standing in line with parents was part of the rhythm of life, as natural as going to school or playing outside. Many grew up with vivid memories of falling asleep in their mother's arms, while waiting in a queue that seemed endless. The night air sharpened their small bodies, too tired to keep standing. Others recalled the excitement when their parents returned home carrying bags filled with rare guzan, orange, a piece of chocolate, a bottle of real fruit juice. These items became treasures, their arrivals celebrated like holidays. Families sometimes gathered around a single sweet, cutting it into equal portions so everyone could taste just a bite. The scarcity created a culture of ritual around food. Families reserved certain meals for special occasions, holding back treasured ingredients for birthdays, New Year's celebrations, or weddings. A jar of imported jam, a box of chocolates, or a bottle of Georgian wine might sit untouched for months, waiting for a moment when it could elevate a gathering into something unforgettable. This ritualistic approach gave food a symbolic power far beyond its taste or nutritional value. It was not only about sustenance, it was about love, care, and marking time in a life that otherwise felt monotonous and difficult. Grandparents played an important role in imagining transmitting stories about food from earlier times. Some recalled the terrifying hunger of the 1930s, when famine devastated villages and left scars across entire regions. Others spoke about the hardships of the war years, when rations dwindled to almost nothing, and survival hinged on sheer will. These stories were often told not as lessons, but as quiet reminders, instilling in younger generations both gratitude for what little they had and caution against waste. To leave a crust of bread unfinished was unthinkable in many households, for it carried with it the echoes of starvation and loss. Food was also central to how families expressed love and care. A grandmother might spend hours making dumplings or baking bread, not because the family had plenty, but because she wanted to stretch what little was available into something comforting. Parents often deprived themselves so that their children could have more. A mother might quietly go without a second helping, pretending she was full so her child could enjoy the extra portion. Fathers might trade goods at work or barter with friends to bring home something special. Each act of sacrifice reinforced bonds within the family, binding them together against the larger hardships of society. But the constant need for sacrifice and improvisation created an undercurrent of stress. Arguments often broke out over how food was distributed within households. If a child was caught sneaking a piece of sugar, or if a husband brought home nothing from the store, tensions could flare. Families lived under constant pressure, knowing that every mistake or careless choice could leave someone hungry. The act of managing food became as important as earning money or keeping the home. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of this responsibility. They carried the invisible weight of planning meals, managing ration cards, and negotiating with shopkeepers, all while maintaining the image of stability for their children. Despite these hardships, there was a remarkable resilience in how families adapted. Many turned to gardening as a way of supplementing their diets. Even those who lived in cities often kept small douches, country plots where they grew potatoes, carrots, cucumbers, or berries. Summers became seasons of work, as entire families traveled to these plots to plant, weed, and harvest. The produce was then preserved in jars, stacked carefully in pantries and basements, ensuring that winter would bring at least some measure of security. These dochas became more than just food sources. They were places where families connected to the land, where children learned to dig in the soil and grandparents passed down agricultural wisdom. Preserving food was an art form in itself. Kitchens filled with the scent of boiling fruit as jars of jam were prepared, their sticky sweetness promising a taste of summer during the cold months. Pickling was equally essential. Cucumbers, cabbage, and tomatoes sealed away to last until spring. These rituals of preservation gave families a sense of control, however small, in a system where so much was dictated from above. Each jar lined on the shelf represented not just food, but foresight, labor, and security. Food also played a role in social exchange. To invite neighbors for a meal, even if humble, was a gesture of trust and solidarity. Sharing a rare item, a piece of sausage, a spoonful of real coffee, was a way of reinforcing bonds. Children learned early that generosity carried meaning far beyond the plate. Even in scarcity, people sought to offer something, however modest, to guests. This culture of hospitality survived despite the shortages and, in some ways, became stronger because of them. When everything was difficult to obtain, giving even a little meant a great deal. Yet, the flip side of scarcity was envy. Families often compared what others had, and jealousy sometimes crept into relationships between neighbors. If one family seemed to always have more with her through connections, black market deals, or sheer luck, it could create resentment. Gossip spread quickly, with whispered suspicions about who was hoarding, who had ties to officials, or who was favored by the system. In this way, food shortages not only united people in shared struggle, but also divided them, subtly shaping the social fabric of entire communities. Children carried these experiences into adulthood, their memories of food shaping their identities long after the Soviet Union collapsed. Many who grew up during this period became adults who were deeply cautious with food, reluctant to waste even a crumb. Others developed a habit of stocking pantries full, unable to shake the fear of scarcity. For them, abundance never felt natural. It always seemed temporary, something that could vanish overnight. Even as shortages persisted, families found joy in small pleasures. The arrival of seasonal fruits, like strawberries or apples, sparked excitement. The chance to bake a cake for a birthday felt like an extraordinary luxury. Holidays, especially New Year's, were occasions when families pulled together every resource to create a table that symbolized hope. A salad with mayonnaise, slices of sausage, a cake covered with sweet cream all became markers of celebration. Their presence on the table carrying as much symbolic weight as the decorations or the gathering itself. Through all this, the table remained both a battleground and a sanctuary. It was where families confronted the reality of scarcity, but also where they expressed resilience, love, and humor. The struggle for food was never just about hunger, it was about what it meant to be a family under constant pressure, what it meant to care for one another when the system made even the simplest act of nourishment a daily challenge. As we continue, we will turn from the family table to the broader structures of society, exploring how collective institutions, schools, and workplaces adapted to the shortages. The story of food in the Soviet Union was not confined to private kitchens. It was woven into every aspect of public life, shaping education, work, and even leisure. And as these spaces reveal, The struggle for food was not only a matter of survival, it was a struggle for dignity, meaning, and hope in a system that promised plenty but delivered scarcity. Food scarcity in the Soviet Union did not end at the doorstep of the family home. It extended into schools, workplaces, and collective institutions, shaping the rhythm of daily life in ways that were both subtle and profound. Where you ate often depended on where you studied or worked, and the communal nature of meals reflected both the ideology of the system and its practical shortcomings. School children grew up with canteens that served standardized meals, often designed less with flavor in mind and more with nutritional quotas and availability. For many children, school lunches were the first time they encountered foods they would otherwise never see at home. Bowls of watery porridge, slices of dense bread, and cups of weak tea were common. On better days, a ladle of cabbage soup or a patty made from ground meat or fish offered some variety. Teachers often encouraged children to eat everything placed before them, reminding them that waste was unacceptable. The atmosphere in these canteens was practical, regimented, and designed to instill both discipline and gratitude, though the reality was often a chorus of groans from students staring at plates of grayish food. For some children, however, these school meals were essential. Families that struggled at home relied on the canteen to provide at least one hot meal a day. This made the difference between chronic hunger and some measure of stability. Yet even in schools, shortages were evident. Teachers might quietly warn children that there would be no meat that week, or that bread portions would be cut smaller. Children quickly learned to adapt, bringing small items from home, perhaps a hard-boiled egg or a piece of cucumber, to supplement what was offered. Universities had their own canteens, but the experience was much the same. Young adults queuing for trays of soup, bread, and boiled grains became a symbol of student life in the Soviet era. Food served there was rarely delicious, but it was cheap, and in many cases, it was simply the only option. Students shared jokes about the mysterious cutlets and often gave dishes nicknames, poking fun at their blandness. Yet even in these jokes lay a sense of shared struggle, a camaraderie born from enduring the same tasteless meals together. Workplaces also became centers of collective eating. Factories, government offices, and collective farms often had canteens designed to provide meals for workers during long shifts. These canteens were supposed to reflect the state's commitment to caring for its labor force, offering sustenance so that productivity could remain high. In reality, much depended on the location and resources of the institution. A factory located near agricultural centers might serve better meals than one in a city far removed from supply lines. Workers often joked that the food in canteens was designed to keep people alive, not to make them happy. Bowls of watery borscht, overcooked pasta, and bread were standard fare. Meat was a rarity, and when it appeared, it was often in small, chewy portions. Still, the canteens served a social purpose. Colleagues gathered at long tables, sharing conversations and jokes that helped them endure the monotony of labor. The act of eating together, no matter how unappetizing the food, reinforced bonds between workers and gave them a space to collectively process their frustrations beyond schools and workplaces. The Soviet system also attempted to address food shortages through rationing and state distribution networks. People were assigned ration cards, which determined how much flour, sugar, or oil they could purchase. These cards were a lifeline, but they also reinforced the sense of constant surveillance and control. Families lived with the knowledge that their ability to eat was tied not only to money, but also to paperwork and quotas. To misplace or lose a ration card was a disaster, often leaving a family unable to claim their meager share. Some institutions, particularly those tied to the military or favored industries, enjoyed better supplies. Soldiers, for example, were guaranteed meals, though not necessarily good ones. Military rations were functional, designed for energy and endurance rather than taste. Yet compared to civilians, soldiers were sometimes better fed, creating resentment among ordinary families. Workers in strategically important factories could also benefit from better food provisions, creating a hierarchy of scarcity where one's occupation determined not just status but survival. The collective farm, or cocos, represented another layer of complexity. These farms were supposed to produce food for the nation, but workers often lived with shortages themselves. While official quotas required much of the harvest to be handed over to the state, families relied on small personal plots to feed themselves. These plots, though tiny, became lifelines, producing vegetables, eggs, or milk that supplemented the meager rations. Collective farms sometimes organized communal meals during harvest season, when everyone was expected to work long hours in the fields. These meals, often just bread, soup, and tea, were meant to sustain the laborers, though they rarely offered enough to satisfy hunger after a day of grueling work. Despite the monotony and shortages, communal meals carried a social dimension that could not be ignored. Sitting at a table with colleagues or classmates, even when the food was poor, created a sense of unity. People shared complaints, laughed at the absurdity of their meals, and found solace in the company of others. Humor became a coping mechanism. Jokes about food, about the rubbery meat, the invisible fish in the soup, or the eternal queues for bread circulated widely, becoming part of the cultural fabric of Soviet life. These jokes often masked a deeper truth. Food shortages highlighted the contradictions of the Soviet system. The ideology promised abundance through collective effort, but the reality was endless scarcity. Propaganda posters showed smiling families gathered around tables filled with bread, milk, and meat, yet ordinary citizens knew such scenes were fantasies. This dissonance between promise and reality fueled both cynicism and resilience. People learned to survive not by believing in the system, but by finding ways to outmaneuver it through bartering, gardening, or building networks of exchange. In some cases, the communal approach to food fostered creativity. Workers might trade portions, swapping a bowl of soup for extra bread or saving a piece of meat to bring home. Students developed rituals around their canteen meals, turning the blandness into shared stories that bonded them for years. These small acts of adaptation gave meaning to meals that might otherwise have been purely dysfunctional. But shortages also left scars. Many who lived through the system remembered not only hunger but also the humiliation of standing in line for hours, only to be told that supplies had run out. The feeling of powerlessness, of being unable to provide for one's family despite working hard, eroded trust in the promises of the state. For parents, the inability to guarantee food for their children was a source of quiet despair, one that no amount of propaganda could erase. As the decades passed, the shortages never fully disappeared. Some periods were better than others, but the rhythm of queues, ration cards, and communal canteens remained part of Soviet life. For many, this experience shaped not only their relationship with food, but also their view of the state itself. The daily struggle for sustenance revealed the limits of a system that claimed to care for everyone equally, but in practice delivered inequality, frustration, and exhaustion. Still, in the midst of these hardships, people carved out spaces of dignity. A student sharing bread with a friend, a worker laughing at the absurdity of his factory meal, a family planting potatoes at their dock. These moments were small, but they carried immense significance. They showed that even in a system of scarcity, human resilience, humor, and care could survive. As we move forward into the next segment, the focus will shift toward the broader political and cultural implications of food shortages. How did the state use food as a tool of control? How did propaganda shape the way people understood their hunger? And what role did black markets and unofficial networks play in bridging the gaps left by the system? To answer these questions, we will need to move beyond kitchens and canteens into the larger stage of Soviet society, where food was not only nourishment, but also politics, power, and protest. Food in the Soviet Union was never just about eating. It was political, symbolic, and deeply tied to the image the state projected of itself. While ordinary citizens stood in lines for bread and worried about how to feed their families, propaganda posters and films painted a very different picture. The gap between this official story and lived reality defined much of the Soviet relationship with food. From the earliest years of the Soviet experiment, leaders recognized that food could be wielded as a tool of control. After the chaos of the Russian Civil War, Lenin introduced the new economic policy in the 1920s, which briefly loosened restrictions and allowed limited private trade. Markets bustled, and for a short while, food seemed more available. But this experiment was short. When Stalin came to power, he reversed much of this openness. He viewed food not as something to be left to individuals, but as a resource to be controlled, distributed, and weaponized. Stalin's collectivization campaigns in the late 1920s and early 1930s forced millions of peasants onto collective farms. The promise was that collective farming would modernize agriculture, increase output, and feed the growing industrial workforce. The reality was famine. The state set impossibly high grain quotas, confiscating food from peasants even as they starved. The most infamous example was the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions perished as grain was exported abroad to fund industrialization while locals were left with nothing. Food became a tool of terror. Loyalty to the state could mean the difference between eating and starving. Propaganda during this period presented a carefully curated image. Posters depicted smiling farm workers holding baskets of wheat, mothers feeding children generous portions of soup, and collective farmers joyfully bringing in the harvest. The imagery was bright, optimistic, and deeply misleading. People who stood in bread lines for hours would walk past these posters and feel the sting of irony. The state insisted abundance was on the horizon, yet in kitchens and canteens across the country, the truth was bitterly obvious. Even as famine receded in later decades, the idea of food as a political instrument persisted. The state tightly controlled what was produced, how it was distributed, and how it was talked about. Official speeches emphasized progress and abundance, often citing statistics that bore little resemblance to reality. Leaders boasted of record grain harvests, while ordinary people still queued for bread. The disconnect between rhetoric and reality was so stark that it became a kind of fear to everyone. Knew the statistics were inflated, but to question them publicly was dangerous. Food shortages also exposed the hierarchy of privilege within the Soviet system. Party officials, military officers, and elites often had access to special stores stocked with goods unavailable to ordinary citizens. These closed shops, known as special distribution centers, carried items like caviar, imported cheese, or good cuts of meat, For the vast majority of the population, such abundance was unimaginable. The existence of these shops, though rarely acknowledged openly, was an open secret that deepened resentment. It revealed that despite the ideology of equality, the Soviet system reproduced inequality in the most basic human need. Eating propaganda also emphasized the communal aspect of food. Images of collective dining, factory canteens, and family meals reinforced the idea that socialism meant sharing resources. This imagery contrasted sharply with capitalist depictions of individual consumption and choice. Yet in practice, the communal experience often meant communal deprivation. Long queues became sites of social interaction, where people shared gossip, frustrations, and rumors about where food might be available. In a strange way, the scarcity created a kind of public square. The breadline was both a place of suffering and a place where community bonds were formed. The breadline itself became symbolic of Soviet life. To stand in line for hours, not knowing whether the food would run out before you reached the front, was both exhausting and demoralizing. People developed elaborate strategies for navigating queues. Friends and neighbors would hold places for one another, sometimes creating informal networks of cooperation. At other times, competition flared, fights broke out, and tempers boiled when supplies ran short. The breadline was a microcosm of Soviet society, capturing both the solidarity and the desperation that defined daily survival. Beyond the breadline, food shortages gave rise to a shadow economy, the black market. Officially condemned as illegal and counter-revolutionary, it nonetheless became indispensable. Peasants sold produce from their private plots, urban workers bartered goods, and connections with store clerks or truck drivers could mean access to items otherwise unavailable. A worker might trade factory-made shoes for potatoes. A student might offer tutoring in exchange for eggs. These informal networks were risky but necessary. The state could never fully stamp them out, because without them, too many would have gone hungry. Yet propaganda continued to insist that the Soviet Union was a land of abundance. Films depicted cheerful workers gathering round tables, toasting to progress with glasses of milk. Children in cartoons were shown devouring candy and fruit, symbols of a future where scarcity had been banished. The irony was not lost on citizens. Parents who watched these cartoons with their children often faced the painful task of explaining why the bright worlds on the screen bore so little resemblance to their own kitchens. The cultural meaning of food shortages also extended into language and humor. Soviet citizens became adept at using irony to comment on their circumstances. A popular joke went, "In capitalism, man exploits man. In socialism, it's the other way around." Another variant centered on food. "In capitalism, you worry about money. In socialism, you worry about finding food to spend it on." These jokes, while light-hearted on the surface, carried the weight of frustration, resignation, and quiet rebellion. The shortages also left psychological marks. Generations grew up associating abundance with privilege and scarcity with normal life. Many people developed lifelong habits of hoarding, unwilling to throw away even small scraps of food. Some saved crusts of bread in their freezers for years, haunted by memories of going without. For them, food was never taken for granted. Every potato, every spoon of sugar, every piece of meat represented struggle, survival, and the thin line between stability and hunger. The state, aware of the symbolic power of food, often tried to cover up crises or redirect blame. Leaders would frame shortages as temporary setbacks, sabotage by enemies, or the result of weather disasters, rather than systemic flaws. In public speeches, they reassured citizens that the future would bring plenty, asking them to endure just a little longer. This rhetoric mirrored earlier promises during industrialization that sacrifice today would bring abundance tomorrow. Yet the tomorrow of abundance never seemed to arrive. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet diet had settled into a kind of weary routine. Bread, potatoes, cabbage, beets, and occasionally fish or meat. These staples were deeply embedded in the culture, but they also reflected limitation. Dishes were filling, but often repetitive. Housewives became experts at stretching ingredients, turning leftovers into soups or casseroles, and finding creative ways to make bland food more palatable. Cookbooks of the era often read like survival guides, offering instructions for meals that could be made with whatever was on hand, rather than with a planned set of ingredients. Through it all, food remained deeply tied to power. To grant access to abundance was to grant privilege. To withdraw it was to punish. Entire populations, such as dissidents, prisoners, or marginalized groups, were denied adequate food as a method of control. Prisons and labor camps, where rations were minimal and survival was brutal, revealed the extremes of how the state used food as leverage over human lives. In the next batch, we will explore how food scarcity shaped not only Soviet daily life, but also broader culture, how literature, film, and personal memory kept alive the contradictions of a system that promised abundance yet delivered hunger. We will look at how Soviet citizens carried these experiences into the post-Soviet era, and how memories of scarcity still echo today. Food in the Soviet Union was more than nourishment. It was a symbol that carried cultural meaning, political weight, and emotional memory. Beyond breadlines and shortages, food seeped into literature, cinema, jokes, and the private recollections of millions of families. It became one of the most important ways Soviet people made sense of their world. Writers, poets, and filmmakers returned to the theme of scarcity again and again, not always directly, but often through metaphor and imagery. In Soviet novels of the mid-20th century, meals frequently appeared not as lavish feasts, but as small, almost ceremonial moments, an onion divided carefully among a group, a hunk of black bread shared on a work break, a boiled potato described with more reverence than a banquet. These passages revealed not abundance, but the deep appreciation people developed for even the most modest of foods. Russian literature had long attached symbolic weight to bread. In earlier centuries, bread was tied to ritual, tradition, and hospitality. In Soviet times, bread took on an even sharper significance. It was not just food, but survival. Many older citizens recalled childhood memories of being told never to waste even a crumb, because bread represented life itself. Writers often described bread with reverence, sometimes casting it almost as a sacred object. To dream of bread, to smell bread baking, to taste warm bread fresh from the oven, these were memories seared into cultural consciousness, especially for those who lived through the famines and wartime shortages. Cinema, too, often reflected the contradictions of Soviet food culture. Official films, produced under strict state control, presented images of abundance. In cheerful musicals, farmers carried oversized baskets of apples and grain. Smiling workers sat down at canteen tables filled with hearty meals, and children clutched ice cream cones as symbols of progress. These images were part of the ideological theater, carefully staged to convey the message that socialism was delivering prosperity. Yet beneath the surface, viewers understood the contrast. They knew that such feasts were rare in their own kitchens. In private, they might mock the exaggerated depictions or laugh bitterly at the gap between screen and reality. Meanwhile, in the post-war years, films that dealt with hardship did so indirectly. A scene might show a soldier eating with visible gratitude, savoring a spoonful of soup. A mother might be shown stretching a pot of thin stew to feed her family. These small details resonated deeply because they reflected the lived experience of viewers. To watch a character on screen carefully scrape the last bit of porridge from a bowl was to recognize something profoundly familiar. Food also shaped personal memory in intimate ways. Generations of Soviet families told stories centered around meals or the absence of them. A grandmother might recall the taste of a rare orange received as a child during New Year's celebrations, describing it decades later with vivid detail: the smell of the peel, the sweetness of the juice, the way everyone in the family shared slices so that each could have a taste. For her grandchildren, who might have grown up in a later period of relative stability, these stories conveyed both hardship and resilience. Scarcity also gave rise to rituals of sharing and creativity. Families learned to make do with limited supplies, often transforming food preparation into acts of ingenuity. Housewives boiled jam from scraps of fruit, stretched meat with bread or grain, and invented recipes that substituted for ingredients unavailable in stores. These dishes, though born from necessity, became beloved traditions. A potato pie, for example, might be remembered with warmth, not because it was luxurious, but because it represented the care and effort that went into feeding a family under difficult circumstances. Black humor often surrounded food shortages, serving as a coping mechanism. Soviet citizens developed countless jokes about queues, about store shelves that held only vinegar or mustard, about the paradox of hearing official reports of record harvests while eating nothing but cabbage for weeks. One joke went, "What's the definition of a Soviet optimist? Someone who brings a spoon with him when he goes shopping." Another quipped, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work. They pretend to feed us, and we pretend to be full." These jokes, repeated in kitchens, factory floors, and even whispered in lines, created a sense of shared resilience. Humor softened the sharp edges of deprivation. Food also marked important transitions in Soviet life. Weddings, holidays, and funerals were measured not just by attendance, but by what food could be served. A wedding without meat dishes was a sign of hardship, while a funeral meal often included symbolic foods like kusha, a sweet grain dish that carried spiritual weight. For New Year's, the most important celebration of the Soviet calendar, families saved all year to prepare a table that felt abundant, even if it was modest by other standards. The presence of mandarins, sparkling wine, and the beloved salad olivier was enough to make people feel that, for one night, scarcity had been banished. Scarcity also shaped the psychology of generations who grew up in the Soviet Union. Even long after the collapse of the system, many carried habits formed in those years. They stocked pantries with excess supplies, kept bags of flour or sugar hidden away, and were reluctant to waste even the smallest scraps of food. For some, the trauma of going hungry remained fresh decades later. They told their children and grandchildren stories as warnings. Never assume food will always be available. Always prepare for shortages. These habits, passed down like folklore, ensured that memories of scarcity remained alive even in times of abundance. The state itself contributed to this legacy by framing food as a reward for loyalty and sacrifice. During war, citizens were told to endure hunger for the sake of victory. During industrialization, they were promised that today's shortages would create tomorrow's plenty. When abundance failed to materialize, the narrative shifted, but the promise was never abandoned. This constant appeal to endurance, sacrifice, and deferred reward shaped not just diets, but cultural expectations. People became accustomed to waiting, hoping, and enduring disappointment. Writers of the late Soviet era began to break through some of the silences around food scarcity. In memoirs and underground literature, they described the bitterness of hunger, the absurdity of standing in queues for hours, the humiliation of begging a store clerk for scraps. These accounts, often circulated secretly, captured the frustration that could not be spoken aloud in public. They also laid the foundation for post-Soviet reflection, as later generations sought to understand the psychological scars left by decades of deprivation. Even today, food remains one of the most powerful symbols of Soviet memory. For those who lived through the shortages, stories about breadlines, black markets, and ingenious recipes are not just anecdotes, they are pieces of history carried in the body. The taste of black bread, the smell of cabbage soup, the sight of a long queue snaking around a block, these details live on in memory, shaping how people recall an era that promised abundance but delivered struggle in the next batch. We will turn to the broader social and political consequences of food shortage, how scarcity affected gender roles, urban and rural divides, and how the struggle for food shaped Soviet identity itself. We'll explore how kitchens became political spaces, how women bore the brunt of managing scarcity, and how the search for food connected every aspect of Soviet daily life. Food in the Soviet Union was never just about hunger and nourishment. It was deeply entangled with social structures, gender expectations, and the unwritten rules of survival. The constant shadow of scarcity shaped how families functioned, how men and women divided labor, how city and countryside diverged, and even how neighbors and colleagues interacted. Kitchens became political spaces, and the daily quest for food became one of the strongest forces holding Soviet society together, while also quietly eroding faith in the system that governed it. One of the most striking consequences of food shortages was the burden placed on women. Across the Soviet Union, it was typically women who bore the responsibility for feeding the household. Even when they worked full-time jobs in factories, offices, or schools, they were also expected to manage queues, hunt down supplies, and stretch meager rations into something edible. The double burden of paid labor and unpaid domestic work was already heavy. Food scarcity made it even heavier for a Soviet woman. A typical day might involve finishing a long shift, only to join a queue that wound around a block, waiting hours in bitter cold or summer heat for the chance of securing bread, meat, or butter. She might then have to rush across town, having heard a rumor that a certain store was delivering sausages, carrying heavy bags on crowded trams or buses. At home, she would experiment endlessly, trying to turn a handful of potatoes, a few carrots, and a small piece of fish into a meal that would satisfy her family. Her ingenuity was not praised as culinary art, it was simply survival. Many women later recalled those years with exhaustion, describing how the constant chase for food consumed their energy, leaving little room for rest or leisure. Men were often less directly involved in the hunt for food, though their experiences were shaped by it as well. In some cases, They took pride in securing rare items through workplace connections or trips to the countryside. Yet the heavy labor of standing in queues and bargaining in stores often fell to women. This imbalance fed into broader gender dynamics, reinforcing expectations that women would carry the hidden, unpaid responsibilities of family survival. The divide between city and countryside added another layer of complexity. While Soviet propaganda portrayed industrial progress as the future, life in rural villages often provided advantages when it came to food. Families who lived on collective farms or who had access to private garden plots were better able to supplement their diets with homegrown produce, eggs, milk, or meat. These plots, though small, became essential lifelines. Urban dwellers, by contrast, depended almost entirely on state-run stores. They often envied rural relatives who could barter or bring food during visits. Many city families maintained close ties to the countryside, relying on networks of kinship to secure supplies. A grandmother in a village might send jars of pickled vegetables or dried mushrooms by train to her children and grandchildren in Moscow or Leningrad. The packages were eagerly awaited, not just for the food, but for the sense of care and connection they carried. These rural-urban exchanges highlighted a paradox at the heart of Soviet life. The system was built on the promise of industrial strength and centralized planning. Yet survival often depended on small-scale, informal, even semi-illegal practices. People relied on private gardens, quiet bartering, and mutual favors far more than on official distribution channels. This underground economy of survival created a constant tension between the ideology of abundance and the reality of dependence. On personal networks, within this context, the kitchen emerged as a powerful space. Soviet kitchens were often small, cramped, and shared in communal apartments. Yet they were also places of extraordinary creativity, conversation, and even dissent. Women swapped recipes that used minimal ingredients, shared tips on where certain foods might be found, and whispered complaints about shortages. Over plates of thin soup or cups of tea, families gathered to talk about their frustrations. Neighbors invited one another in, comparing notes about what they had managed to buy. The kitchen became a semi-private zone where official narratives could be questioned, while state media declared that shelves were full and production was strong. Families sitting around a modest kitchen table knew the truth. They could taste it in every diluted stew, every slice of bread rationed carefully among them. To complain too loudly in public could be dangerous, but within the walls of the kitchen, frustrations flowed freely. Many historians later described the Soviet kitchen as the birthplace of quiet resistance, a place where citizens developed their own version of reality that stood in sharp contrast to propaganda. Scarcity also shaped relationships among neighbors and colleagues. News of a store receiving a delivery traveled quickly by word of mouth. Sometimes people would call friends to share the information. Other times, they would keep it secret, hoping to secure their place in line before supplies ran out. Trust and betrayal intertwined in these moments. A neighbor who shared information about eggs arriving at a local shop could be a hero, while one who hoarded the knowledge could be resented. Friendships and rivalries were built on the simple act of who told whom about food. Workplaces became arenas of food politics as well. Certain jobs provided access to better supplies. Workers in food factories sometimes had opportunities to bring home items otherwise unavailable. Drivers who transported goods could set aside small portions before delivery. These informal perks became part of the hidden economy of survival. At the same time, envy and inequality grew. Those with access to food often held quiet power over those without it. Children absorbed these dynamics in their own way. They grew up learning to recognize cues as part of daily life, understanding that candy, meat, or even milk could not be taken for granted. Many later recalled feeling embarrassed when they brought simple lunches to school, knowing others might have slightly better meals. Yet they also developed resilience, learning to savor small pleasures and appreciate even minor treats. A single piece of chocolate, divided among siblings, became a memory treasured for decades. The rituals around food also revealed the contradictions of Soviet ideology. The state preached collective equality, yet food distribution often highlighted inequality. Elites and party officials enjoyed access to special stores with abundant supplies, while ordinary citizens waited hours for scraps. This visible divide eroded faith in the system, even as people continued to endure its hardships. For many, the gap between official rhetoric and personal experience became impossible to ignore. Food scarcity influenced identity as well. To be Soviet was, in many ways, to share in the struggle for food. The jokes, the cues, the recipes born of improvisation, these became cultural markers. At the same time, the longing for abundance fueled private dreams. People fantasized about full markets, about tables groaning with meat, fruit, and sweets. These dreams persisted across generations, shaping how people imagined a better life by the late Soviet period. Food had become one of the most powerful symbols of dissatisfaction. When citizens talked about shortages, they were not only complaining about empty shelves, they were expressing their disillusionment with a system that had promised plenty but delivered hunger. The daily grind of finding food, of standing in lines, of stretching ingredients, became a metaphor for the broader failures of the Soviet project. In the next batch, we will explore the lived experience of those final Soviet decades, how the collapse of trust in the food system contributed to the unraveling of the Soviet Union itself, and how the legacy of hunger and scarcity shaped post-Soviet identity long after the system ended. By the late decades of the Soviet Union, the struggles surrounding food had hardened into something far larger than mere daily inconvenience. Scarcity was no longer just an occasional disruption, it was the permanent background noise of life. Shelves that were supposed to display the achievements of socialism often sat empty, their sparseness a silent indictment of a system that had once promised prosperity for all. For millions of Soviet citizens, food shortages defined not only what they ate, but how they thought about themselves, their families, and the state that governed them. As the economy stagnated in the 1970s and 1980s, food became one of the clearest markers of systemic failure. The Soviet leadership spoke in glowing terms about industrial strength, harvest goals, and the triumph of socialism. But these speeches rang hollow when people returned home to kitchens where even staples were missing. Shoppers entered stores expecting disappointment. A lonely stack of canned fish, perhaps, or bins of wilted cabbage. Butter, sugar, and meat became increasingly rare. It was in this environment that the black market took on a life of its own. Officially condemned, unofficially tolerated. The market for food outside state channels grew as citizens sought ways to fill the gaps left by shortages. People bought and sold goods through networks of acquaintances, through whispered exchanges in workplaces, or in discreet meetings on city streets. A kilogram of sausages or a handful of oranges might change hands at inflated prices, but for those who could afford it, the expense was worth it. The existence of this shadow economy revealed both the resilience of ordinary people and the fragility of the state's control. The government insisted that socialism had eliminated class divisions, yet access to food once again highlighted inequality. Those with connections, with money, or with positions in key industries had far better chances of securing scarce goods. For everyone else, waiting in endless queues remained the reality. Queues themselves became one of the defining symbols of late Soviet life. A line snaking around a block could appear without warning, sparked by the rumor of a delivery. Strangers would join without even knowing what was being sold. Simply standing in line became a gamble that perhaps something valuable might appear at the counter. People carried bags with them at all times, ready to seize the opportunity if they encountered a queue. Hours were lost each week to this ritual of waiting. Yet queues were not just about food, they were about dignity, patience, and the shared absurdity of a system that forced citizens into such routines. Within these lines, conversations blossomed. People traded gossip, jokes, and frustrations. They developed a gallows humor that allowed them to endure. A popular Soviet joke captured the mood. We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. We pretend to shop, and they pretend to stock the shelves. Such humor was a coping mechanism, a way to articulate the contradiction between ideology and reality. For children growing up in the 1980s, food scarcity left indelible memories. They remember their parents returning from stores with bags that seemed pitifully light, or the excitement when rare items like bananas or chocolate appeared. These moments stood out so vividly precisely because they were so unusual. Holidays such as New Year's became especially important as families saved and planned for weeks to ensure that their tables would feature special treats, mandarins, sparkling wine, or a cake. The symbolism of these holiday foods went beyond taste. They represented hope, celebration, and a fleeting sense of abundance in a world otherwise dominated by shortage. In the countryside, the story looked different. Collective farms were still plagued by inefficiency and corruption, but the presence of private garden plots continued to be a lifeline. Rural families grew potatoes, raised chickens, or kept pigs. Though life was harsh, these small-scale resources often gave them an advantage over their urban relatives. The contrast became so stark that city dwellers regularly traveled to the countryside to barter for food, bringing clothing, tools, or cash in exchange for potatoes and meat. These exchanges blurred the official lines between legal and illegal, permitted and forbidden. The black market and private networks eroded the ideological foundation of the Soviet state. The system was built on the promise that collective planning could provide for all. Yet in practice, survival often depended on bending or breaking the rules. Every trip to a neighbor's kitchen to buy eggs under the table, every whispered deal at a workplace, every garden potato smuggled into the city was a small act of quiet defiance. These acts did not come from political rebellion, but from necessity. Yet in their accumulation, they revealed a society that no longer believed in the promises of its government. The weight of this disbelief grew heavier as the years went on. The state had once justified its sacrifices, the harshness of collectivization, the terror of the purges, the privations of war by pointing to a radiant future. By the 1980s, that future seemed like a cruel joke. Citizens were not comparing themselves to the hardships of the past, but to the abundance they glimpsed across the Iron Curtain. Western goods, whether smuggled in or displayed in films and magazines, provided a constant reminder of what was missing. the sight of jeans, Coca-Cola, or supermarkets filled with food in Western images stood in stark contrast to the barren Soviet shelves. This comparison created a subtle but growing crisis of legitimacy. When citizens spent hours hunting for basic groceries, it became impossible to believe in speeches about progress. Food, once a private struggle, became a public symbol of the gap between ideology and reality. Every empty store was a visible failure of the state, one that no propaganda could disguise. Even as the shortages worsened, people clung to small rituals of hope. Families gathered in their kitchens, finding comfort in each other's company, even if the meals were sparse. They swapped recipes that made use of whatever could be found, stretching cabbage, potatoes, and flour into soups, dumplings, and stews. They preserved vegetables for winter, filled jars with pickles and jams, and carefully rationed out sugar and oil. These acts were not simply about feeding the body, they were about preserving dignity in the face of scarcity. As the Soviet Union staggered toward collapse, food shortages intensified. The late 1980s and early 1990s were marked by empty shelves, ration coupons, and the sense that the system was unraveling. For many, the inability to secure food for their families was the most tangible sign that the Soviet project had failed. The collapse of trust in the food system mirrored the collapse of trust in the government itself. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, citizens did not mourn the loss of endless queues or barren shelves. Instead, they looked forward, however uncertainly, to the possibility of a life where food might be abundant again. Yet the memories of scarcity lingered, shaping attitudes toward food and security for generations to come. Even today, many who lived through the Soviet period speak of stockpiling, of never fully trusting that food will always be available. The hunger of the past left scars that did not fade easily. The story of food in the Soviet Union was never just about meals. It was about power, inequality, gender, resilience, and ultimately, disillusionment. It revealed the limits of a system that demanded sacrifice but failed to provide. And it showed how something as simple as bread or butter could carry immense political and emotional weight. By the final decade of the Soviet Union, the struggle over food had grown into something larger than any single family, farm, or factory. It had become the most visible crack in a once towering structure, the weak seam in a system that claimed to be unshakable. To understand how the Soviet Union's collapse looked and felt to ordinary people, one must begin in its kitchens, its markets, and its stores. Because it was here that the great contradiction between promises and reality came into sharpest focus in speeches. Soviet leaders still declared that the future belonged to socialism. They spoke of harvests, of industrial progress, of the workers and peasants marching toward a better tomorrow. But on the ground, in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and the far-flung provincial towns, citizens spent their mornings checking which store might have flour or butter, spent their afternoons in queues that stretched across courtyards, and spent their evenings wondering how they would feed their children the next day. The contradictions were dizzying. Soviet science had put men into space, had built nuclear submarines, had created weapons capable of reshaping the globe. Yet housewives wept in frustration because they could not find cooking oil for their frying pans. A state that could command armies and satellites seemed powerless. When it came to placing bread on the tables of its people, the shortages of the 1980s became not just an inconvenience, but a crisis of daily existence. The queues that once symbolized quiet endurance grew even longer. sometimes lasting for half a day. To stand in them was to surrender time, dignity, and patience. Men and women carried stools so they could sit, newspapers to keep them occupied, and flasks of tea to sustain them. Entire lives seemed organized around the expectation of waiting. Those who were fortunate enough to make it to the front before supplies ran out carried their prizes like trophies, clutching bags of bread or sausages as though they were worth more than gold. Rationing returned, bringing with it the heavy weight of memory. Coupons were issued for butter, sugar, and even soap. In a society that had long promised plenty, this paper currency of scarcity felt humiliating. Families carefully cut and stored their coupons, knowing that losing one might mean going without for weeks. The coupons were a daily reminder that the state could not be trusted to meet its most basic obligations. Indies atmosphere. Private connections became lifelines. A friend who worked in a store might whisper that a delivery was expected in the morning. A cousin in the countryside might send a sack of potatoes by train. Neighbors knocked on each other's doors to trade flour for tea or eggs for cigarettes. The entire food economy shifted from public to private, from official to underground, until the line between survival and illegality blurred beyond recognition. Black. Markets thrived in this climate of desperation. On city corners, men and women hawked goods from undercoats or out of bags. Meat, butter, imported sweets, even baby formula appeared at steep prices. To buy from them was technically a crime, yet most people did it anyway, for the crime of hunger was far greater. Policemen often looked the other way, for they too had families to feed. Corruption spread like a stain through the system, and with it, the last illusions of equality faded. But if food scarcity exposed the weakness of the state, it also revealed the resilience of the people. Soviet kitchens became laboratories of invention. Housewives and grandmothers created dishes from scraps, stretched flour with potatoes, turned beetroot into countless variations of soups and salads. Cookbooks circulated that taught not the art of fine cuisine, but the art of survival cuisine, how to substitute, how to preserve, how to create sweetness where there was only bitterness. Children of the late 1980s grew up with a keen sense of the extraordinary nature of ordinary foods. To taste a banana was to step into a dream. To unwrap a chocolate bar was to hold a treasure. Birthdays and holidays were marked not by the number of gifts or guests, but by the food that appeared on the table. A roast chicken, a rare delicacy, might be spoken of with reverence for years after the fact. As the shortages deepened, discontent spread. Food had always been political in the Soviet Union, but now it became a language of anger. Empty shelves spoke louder than propaganda posters. The image of women queuing in the cold, children tugging at their sleeves, became symbols of failure that no censorship could erase. In private kitchens, conversations turned openly critical. Neighbors who once whispered their complaints now spoke them more boldly, for everyone shared the same experience. This crisis of food eroded the last reserves of faith in the system. By the late 1980s, even loyal citizens who had once believed in the ideals of socialism could no longer ignore the evidence of their own kitchens. They had sacrificed for decades, been told to wait for the brighter future, and yet their cupboards were bare. Hunger became the great equalizer, binding factory workers, teachers, engineers, and doctors in a shared disillusionment. Yet, there was also irony in this decay. Despite the shortages, the Soviet Union still possessed vast agricultural land, hard-working farmers, and scientific knowledge. The problem was not a lack of capacity, but the failure of the system itself. Inefficient collective farms, broken distribution networks, corruption that siphoned goods away from the people. In many ways, the struggle for food was the clearest proof that the Soviet Union's greatest enemy was not external but internal. As the final years of the 1980s slipped into the early 1990s, the struggle for food became unbearable. Rationing lines stretched for blocks. Families woke before dawn to secure a place. People fainted from exhaustion in the queues. Arguments broke out, sometimes erupting into scuffles or fights. In some towns, bread ran out entirely, forcing bakeries to close their doors. The sense of collapse hung heavy in the air, as though the entire society had run out of nourishment in both the literal and the metaphorical sense. In those last years before the Soviet Union fell apart, food was no longer just a question of survival. It was a question of meaning. What did it mean to live in a state that could build nuclear missiles but could not provide milk for children? What did it mean to pledge loyalty to leaders who promised abundance while one's stomach remained empty? These questions gnawed at citizens. As surely as hunger gnawed at their bodies, it is in this space between the promises of ideology and the reality of daily hunger that the final chapter of the Soviet Union was written. The collapse of the system was not just about political reforms, economic stagnation, or nationalist movements. It was about bread, butter, potatoes, and sugar. It was about the empty shelves that could not be hidden, the queues that stretched too far, the coupons that degraded dignity. The empire did not simply fall, it starved itself from within. If hunger gnawed at the body, then the constant dance with scarcity gnawed at the mind. For Soviet citizens in the 1980s, food shortages were not simply a matter of nutrition. They shaped relationships, psychology, and even identity. To speak of food was to speak of one's dignity, one's ability to provide, and one's relationship to both family and state. The ritual of queuing became one of the most visible aspects of this psychology. Every Soviet adult, regardless of profession or education, knew the peculiar mixture of dread and anticipation that came with standing in line. To queue was to sacrifice time, energy, and often conversations in these lines became a kind of public therapy. Strangers bonded over shared complaints, muttered jokes about the government, or traded recipes for meals that could be made with almost nothing. For many, the queue was less a marketplace and more a confessional booth, where the frustrations of daily life could be aired among sympathetic listeners. Children absorbed this atmosphere deeply. They grew up watching their parents strategize like generals, planning trips across neighborhoods to find food. A rumor of sugar at one store might send a mother rushing across town with her child in tow. The child, tugged along by the hand, learned early the value of vigilance, of listening to whispers, of spotting a delivery truck before others did. These children developed a sixth sense for scarcity. To this day, many who lived through those years recall with vivid detail the smell of freshly baked bread or the sight of oranges at New Year's. Because such experiences were rare and precious, scarcity also rewrote the fabric of relationships. A family member with connections to a warehouse worker or a store clerk became invaluable. Cousins in the countryside were more cherished than ever, their potatoes or homemade preserves treated as life-saving contributions. Friendships could grow stronger under this pressure, but they could also fracture. Envy crept in when one family managed to secure butter while another went without. Neighbors who had once been allies turned into competitors in the race for resources, The kitchen table became a place where gratitude and resentment mixed in equal measure. But alongside resentment, there was creativity. Soviet families transformed their kitchens into laboratories of resilience. Housewives who once dreamed of elegant French cuisine instead became masters of substitution. They invented soups that stretched thin bones into broth for days. They fried patties made of cabbage when meat was impossible to find. They developed elaborate rituals for preserving food, pickling cucumbers, fermenting cabbage, storing beets and carrots in cellars. Winter survival was not simply a matter of state distribution, but of individual. Ingenuity.cookbooks circulated that reflected this reality. Unlike glossy Western magazines filled with images of steaks and roasts, Soviet cookbooks were pragmatic survival manuals. They taught how to create flavor where there was none, how to make bread rise with limited yeast, how to sweeten tea with jam when sugar was scarce. These recipes were not just culinary instructions. They were lifelines, proof that even in deprivation, one could preserve some measure of culture, ritual, and joy. That the psychology of food scarcity also expressed itself in celebration. Holidays became symbolic battles against emptiness. Families saved for months to buy a few special ingredients, turning New Year's tables into feasts that contrasted starkly with the rest of the year. A plate of cold cuts, a small cake, perhaps a bottle of imported soda. These were treasures displayed with pride. For one night, scarcity was suspended, and abundance was performed like theater. Yet the very need to perform it revealed how fragile everyday life had become. Children, especially, were shaped by these rituals. To receive a piece of chocolate, an imported orange, or a slice of sausage at New Year's was to experience joy so intense it burned itself into memory. These foods became mythic, symbols of love and security, often remembered decades later as markers of both deprivation and resilience. It is no accident that in many post-Soviet memoirs, the descriptions of food are among the most detailed and emotional passages. Food was not only sustenance, it was memory, longing, and proof of survival. Psychologically, scarcity also bred irony. Soviet propaganda continued to boast of progress, plastering walls with slogans about abundance and success. Posters depicted overflowing harvests, happy farmers, smiling children with full bowls of soup. Citizens passed these images on their way to stores where the shelves were empty, and the contrast was both bitter and absurd. This daily collision between image and reality nurtured a sharp humor among the people. Jokes about food shortages became some of the most popular in the Soviet underground, mocking the gap between promises and lived experience. For example, one common joke went, "What happens if socialism comes to the Sahara Desert? First, nothing changes for 50 years. Then there's a shortage of sand." Another ran, "What is long, hard, and makes a Soviet man groan? The bread queue." Such jokes, cynical yet affectionate, allowed people to endure what otherwise might have broken their spirit. Humor became both shield and weapon, a way of surviving without surrendering entirely to despair. Yet, for all its dark humor, the psychological toll was undeniable. The constant struggle to feed a family created feelings of inadequacy, even shame. Fathers who could not bring home meat, mothers who had to serve watered-down soups, children who longed for foods they could not have all of them felt the sting of deprivation. Many Soviet citizens carried this wound long after the Union itself collapsed. Even in later years, when supermarket shelves overflowed, some retained the instinct to hoard, to buy in bulk, to never fully trust that abundance would last. The shadow of scarcity lingered in their habits and fears, and still, amidst this hardship, the culture of resilience remained remarkable. People did not stop celebrating birthdays. Weddings still took place, with tables groaning under food that had been painstakingly gathered. Funerals, too, demanded feasts, as if to declare that dignity would not be stripped even in death. Food, or the lack of it, became a canvas upon which people painted their defiance. The Soviet struggle with food in its final decades thus became a paradoxical tale of both despair and endurance. On the one hand, it revealed the system's inability to nourish its people, undermining its legitimacy and contributing to its downfall. On the other hand, it revealed the extraordinary resourcefulness of those very people, who found ways to turn scarcity into survival, and survival into memory. By the late 1980s, as the Union itself began to fracture, this dual legacy remained: empty shelves that spoke of political failure, and crowded kitchens that spoke of human resilience. Food was no longer just about calories or meals. It was about the relationship between state and citizen, promise and reality, hunger and hope. By the late 1980s, food was no longer simply a private struggle managed at the kitchen table. It had become a national crisis, a visible wound exposing the Soviet system's failure to deliver on its promises. As reforms like perestroika and glasnost opened new avenues for speech, food shortages were among the most common complaints voiced publicly. The emptiness of store shelves and the endlessness of queues became not just inconveniences, but symbols of a society that could no longer provide for its people. Citizens began to experience scarcity in more extreme forms than before, where once one might have at least found cabbage, potatoes, or black bread. Now even these staples disappeared for weeks at a time. Rationing returned in many regions, echoing the war years. Coupons were distributed for sugar, butter, tobacco, and alcohol, and yet the coupons themselves did not guarantee supply. To clutch a ration book was to hold a document that often mocked its own purpose, proof that even the basics were out of reach. People spoke bitterly of money without goods, wages that filled pockets but could buy little. The very concept of currency seemed hollow when a roll of toilet paper or a jar of instant coffee carried more value in practical life. Urban life grew especially tense. In Moscow and Leningrad, long lines became part of the cityscape, winding around blocks and choking sidewalks. People rose before dawn to secure a place in line, bringing stools or newspapers to sit on. Elderly pensioners leaned on canes for hours, hoping for a small bag of flour or a kilo of sausage. When delivery trucks finally arrived, chaos erupted. Crowds surged forward, tempers flared, and the pushing could turn violent. Police sometimes intervened to keep order, but even they were not immune to shortages. Stories circulated of officers quietly buying goods for themselves before the public could reach them. This public theater of scarcity was humiliating. For a nation that had once claimed to embody modern progress, the contrast with Western supermarkets, which some Soviet citizens glimpsed in foreign magazines or television broadcasts, was devastating. Images of shelves stacked high with colorful goods in Europe or the United States circulated quietly, and they seemed almost fictional, like fantasies from another planet. When travelers returned from abroad, their stories about the availability of bananas, cheese, or fresh meat were met with both envy and disbelief. For those stuck at home, the Soviet store, with its grey counters and its empty bins, felt like a stage set for despair. In the countryside, villagers fared differently. Many had long relied on their own garden plots, raising potatoes, onions, and livestock on small pieces of land. These personal plots, though technically limited by law, became lifelines. Chickens in backyards, pigs fattened on scraps, and cabbages growing in neat rows allowed families to supplement meager rations. Often, city relatives depended on these rural cousins, traveling by train to bring back sacks of potatoes or jars of pickles. Yet this reliance on subsistence farming exposed the irony at the heart of Soviet life. A supposedly industrialized superpower survived in large part on the private gardens of its citizens. The black market flourished as shortages deepened. Known colloquially as blat, this system of favors, connections, and illicit trades became an economy in itself. A butcher might quietly sell cuts of meat to friends behind closed doors, or a store manager might reserve butter for acquaintances. Bribes in vodka or Western cigarettes greased the system, creating a hierarchy of access. Those without connections suffered most, while those who could navigate the web of favors lived slightly more comfortably. But even the privileged were never fully secure. The unpredictability of supply meant that no one could rest easy. At any moment, a shortage could level the playing field, reducing even the well-connected to the same lines as everyone else. The social fabric strained under this weight. Trust eroded as people competed for limited goods. Petty theft increased, particularly of food items. Families accused one another of hoarding, and rumors of who had butter or who had hidden sugar spread like wildfire. Yet even as resentment grew, solidarity sometimes re-emerged. In the same queues where tempers flared, friendships were born, and acts of generosity appeared. A loaf of bread might be shared, or a place in line saved for a struggling mother with children. In this way, scarcity revealed both the ugliest and the most compassionate sides of human nature. Psychologically, the shortages of the late 1980s weighed heavily on the collective psyche. People spoke of living in a state of constant anxiety, of never being sure what tomorrow might bring. Housewives walked into stores not with shopping lists, but with open-ended hope, ready to buy whatever was available. Men returned home ashamed when their efforts yielded only a stale loaf or a few wilted carrots. Children grew accustomed to disappointment, learning not to expect sweets or treats except on rare occasions. Hunger was not always starvation, but it was a slow grind that shaped thought, behavior, and memory. At the same time, disillusionment with the state grew sharper. For decades, propaganda had painted scarcity as a temporary problem, something caused by war, weather, or Western sabotage. But by the late 1980s, those explanations rang hollow. People no longer believed that empty shelves were accidents. They saw them instead as proof of systemic failure, evidence that the dream of socialism had rotted from within. The phrase "deficit deficit" became one of the most commonly uttered words of the era, a bitter joke and a daily reality, as the Soviet Union staggered toward collapse. Food shortages became more than a domestic problem. They fed into the growing unrest across republics, where nationalist movements pointed to Moscow's inability to provide as further justification for independence. To struggle for bread in Moscow was one thing. To struggle in Kiev, Tbilisi, or Vilnius was another, where local grievances merged with hunger to form a powerful fuel for protest. In this way, the shortage of sausage or flour was never just about diet. It was about identity, power, and legitimacy. Meanwhile, moments of surreal absurdity punctuated the struggle. Some stores stocked bizarre surpluses of items no one wanted: rows of pickled beets, mountains of canned fish, endless jars of mustard. People joked that the Soviet diet was built not on choice, but on endurance. The ability to make yet another meal of herring or cabbage. There were stories of people trading fur hats for butter, of engineers selling prized possessions just to afford meat. Every exchange revealed how deeply the economy had unraveled. In homes, the rituals of cooking took on almost sacred meaning. Families gathered to stretch ingredients as far as possible, to savor even the simplest meals. A pot of soup simmering on the stove was a sign of stability in a world unraveling. Parents shielded their children from the full extent of scarcity, skipping meals themselves so the young could eat. Sacrifice became the unspoken language of love, and survival became a family project by the final years of the Union. The queues themselves began to feel like symbols of rebellion. To stand in a breadline was not just to seek food, but to participate in a silent demonstration of failure. The government's inability to hide the shortages, to paper them over with slogans, revealed the crumbling of control. Every empty shelf was an accusation. Every ration coupon was a confession, and every hungry stomach was a vote against the system. When the Union finally collapsed in 1991, many citizens remember the moment not through speeches or flags, but through food. The last Soviet meals, tin soups, black bread, cabbage stews became emblems of an era. The taste of scarcity lingered in memory long after the political banners were taken down. For some, the fall of the Soviet Union was not the end of a state, but the end of hunger. For others, it was the beginning of a new uncertainty, as the chaos of the 1990s brought its own struggles. But in those final years, food was the daily reminder of fragility. Every empty shelf was a warning that no empire, however vast, could survive if it could not feed its people. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not instantly bring abundance to the tables of its people. In fact, for many, the years immediately after 1991 were some of the most chaotic and uncertain they had ever known. Shelves that had once been bare suddenly filled with goods, but those goods were often priced far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The security of low, fixed prices evaporated overnight, replaced by an inflation that devoured savings and reduced pensions to almost nothing. To walk into a store and see bananas, chocolate, and sausages stacked high was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. Exhilarating because such bounty had been unthinkable for decades. Heartbreaking because so few could afford it. This contrast between plenty and poverty deepened the wound left by decades of scarcity. People who had once lined up for cabbage now lined up to pawn jewelry or sell possessions at flea markets just to buy bread. Families who had dreamed of full tables found themselves confronting a new reality in which food was palatable but financially out of reach. Hunger had changed. Shape, it was no longer about supply, but about access. And in that shift lay the cruel irony of transition. Abundance without affordability could sting as much as scarcity. Yet the memory of the Soviet struggle with food lingered and, in many ways, shaped how people navigated the turbulence of the 1990s. Those who had grown up under shortages carried habits of preservation into the new era. Freezers filled with meat, pantries stuffed with jars of pickles and preserves, sacks of potatoes stored in basements. These became legacies of a culture trained by years of uncertainty. Even when supermarkets brimmed with choices, people still stocked up just in case, unable to shake the instinct that tomorrow might bring emptiness again. Scarcity had carved itself into their reflexes, into the very rhythm of how meals were planned and eaten. The Soviet struggle with food also left behind a cultural imprint that extended beyond kitchens and pantries. It shaped humor, with jokes about queues, ration books, and endless cabbage soup becoming part of shared memory. It shaped nostalgia, with older generations recalling the taste of homemade rye bread or the smell of potatoes roasting on a wood stove as symbols of endurance and resilience. And it shaped politics, as memories of shortages became powerful tools in debates about the legacy of the Soviet system. For many, food was not just about survival, it was about dignity. The humiliation of waiting in line for hours only to go home empty-handed left scars. Parents remembered their children's disappointment, the way they clutched small hands and tried to hide their own frustration. Workers remembered trudging home after long shifts, unable to find a piece of meat to bring back to their families. Elderly citizens remembered ration books as shackles, symbols that the system could not care for them in their final years. These experiences became part of the collective consciousness, woven into the identity of a generation. At the same time, resilience became another part of that identity. People remembered how they adapted, how they found ways to stretch flour into endless dumplings or turn beets into both salads and soups. They remembered the solidarity that sometimes bloomed in the harshest conditions, neighbors sharing sugar, colleagues pooling money for bulk purchases, strangers holding places in line for mothers with children. Scarcity may have tested their patience and their faith, but it also tested their ingenuity, their generosity, and their will to endure. Looking back, the story of food in the Soviet Union is more than a tale of shortages and hunger. It is a story about power, control, and the human spirit. The state's promise to feed its people was one of the most basic contracts it could make, and its failure to uphold that promise eroded trust more effectively than any foreign propaganda ever could. Empty shelves were not just about missing sausages. They were about missing faith in the system itself. As the Soviet Union fractured, food became a metaphor for its larger decline. The empire that had launched satellites and built nuclear arsenals could not put enough bread on the table. The contradiction was too stark, too visible, and too personal. It was one thing to hear about economic inefficiency in abstract terms. It was another to feel your stomach growl while staring at bare store shelves. Hunger cuts through ideology. It is raw, undeniable, and universal today. Decades after the Soviet Union's collapse, the memories of those years still echo in kitchens across the former republics. Older generations tell stories of lines stretching around city blocks, of the joy of receiving a single orange at New Year, of the creative meals they crafted from almost nothing. Younger generations listen, sometimes with disbelief, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with gratitude that they do not have to endure the same struggles. The memory of scarcity has become a lesson, a reminder of what happens when a system promises abundance but delivers emptiness. And yet, for all its hardship, many who lived through those years also recall moments of tenderness, of shared laughter in queues, of family meals that felt precious precisely because they were rare. They remember how even the simplest food bred warm from the oven, soup shared with neighbors, carried meaning far beyond its taste. In a world of scarcity, every meal was a victory, every bite a testament to survival. The forgotten hardships of food in the Soviet Union were not forgotten at all. They were carried forward, tucked into recipes, habits, and memories. They became part of the way people understood themselves, their families, and their history. To speak of those years is to speak of struggle, but also of strength. To recall the shortages is to recall the creativity and endurance that turned so little into enough in the end. The story of why food was a daily struggle in the Soviet Union is not just about bread lines, ration books, or empty shelves. It is about people, ordinary men and women who endured extraordinary challenges. It is about the resilience of families who found ways to survive in the face of systemic failure. It is about the quiet dignity of parents who gave up their portions for their children, of neighbors who shared when they themselves had little, of communities that held together under immense strain. The Soviet Union is gone, but the lessons remain. They remind us that abundance cannot be measured by production quotas or propaganda, but by the simple reality of food on the table. They remind us that no ideology can override the basic human need for nourishment and dignity. And they remind us that in times of struggle, survival is not only about what we eat, but about how we endure together. And so, the story closes not in despair, but in reflection. The hardships were real, the struggles profound, but so too was the resilience. To remember the food shortages of the Soviet Union is to remember the resilience of its people. And in that remembrance lies a quiet kind of victory won, not measured in full shelves, but in the strength of those who lived through emptiness and carried on.